think there's undoubtedly a case for saying that the time he spent in isolation over COVID, I mean, he spent about 2 years basically on his own, well, with his staff in his dacha outside Moscow. And he is acting very forcefully and perhaps with a lack of restraint that wouldn't have been true 5 or 10 years ago.
Hello and welcome to Frontline with me, Philip Ingram. Now, today we're privileged to be talking to Eliot Wilson. Now, Eliot, I think this is your first time in Frontline, but you were a clerk of the House of Commons between 2005 and 2016, where you worked on the Defence Committee. You were secretary of the UK delegation to the NATO Parliamentary Assembly. You're now a writer and commentator on politics, international affairs, security, and you write for City AM, The Spectator, The Hill, and have just taken up as a contributing editor to Defence on the Brink. Eliot, welcome to Frontline.
Delighted to be here, Philip. Yes, thank you.
There's lots going on at the moment, and President Donald Trump on Sunday said, "I've always had a very good relationship with Vladimir Putin of Russia, but something has happened to him. He's gone crazy." Typical Trump sort of dialogue that's coming out. He's needlessly killing lots of people. I'm not just talking about soldiers. Missiles and drones are being shot into the cities in Ukraine for no reason whatsoever. Only a few weeks ago, he said, "Vladimir, stop it." Now, what do you make of Trump's outburst? And is it too early to say he is beginning to see the reality of the Russians and of Putin?
Well, it's sort of multi-layered, isn't it? I mean, there is a deep irony in Donald Trump saying that somebody is acting unreasonably and without any sort of consequences or notion of logic. I mean, that's how he's always operated. And equally, that people are gathering around and saying that something's happened to Putin neurologically or psychologically. I think, well, the physician, heal thyself first. It may be that Putin has changed over the past few years. I mean, I think there's undoubtedly a case for saying that the time he spent in isolation over COVID, I mean, he spent about 2 years basically on his own, well, with his staff in his dacha outside Moscow. And he is acting very forcefully and perhaps with a lack of restraint that wouldn't have been true 5 or 10 years ago. At the same time, I'm not entirely sure that you can say that he's acting irrationally. I mean, if you understand what his war aims are, which is the complete conquest, absorption, and pretty much dissolution of Ukraine, because he doesn't believe that Ukraine exists, he doesn't believe it's a nation state or a people or an ethnic group, then I think he's acting in a relatively straightforward way, albeit one that's extremely no compromises and playing hardball. But then if you look at the American response, he's getting no pushback except from some mad tweets from Donald Trump. So it's hard to see why he would fall back from what he's doing. But I agree, he's acting in an extremely ruthless and brutal way, but then he's an extremely ruthless and brutal man.
Do you think he thinks he's winning and can take Ukraine by military means?
I don't think he's convinced he can't. I think he must have, even if he's in a sort of bubble of unreality, as all leaders are to an extent, he must have been surprised and shocked by the ferocity of the Ukrainian response when he first invaded in February 2022, and by the simple lack of progress. I mean, we know that there were senior people in the Kremlin and the security agencies literally picking out apartments in Kyiv where they would live because they expected to be there in about 3 days. They expected the war to be done in a couple of weeks, all told. And they didn't expect anything like the pushback. I mean, I remember somebody saying at the time, we used to think that Russia had the second biggest army, second best army in Europe. Turns out it doesn't have the second best army in Ukraine. But I think he must have taken that as a setback, but I think he's probably got over that. He understands that in a sheer numbers game, he can't lose against Ukraine because he will keep feeding raw recruits and conscripts into the meat grinder, which is the Soviet method of war and was during the Second World War. I think what's interesting is to take a step back and think, well, what would Ukraine's war aims be? I mean, obviously they want to survive as an independent nation, which is not unreasonable, but they don't really have a total victory in sight. I mean, they're not going to be Ukrainian tanks rumbling through Red Square in a victory parade. We know that. Whereas it's not utterly impossible that the Russians could do that in Kyiv. So it's a slight imbalance in that respect. I think Putin realizes that, firstly, he can continue this war for some time, though the cost is pretty dramatic. I mean, they're well into the hundreds of thousands of Russian dead now, and they must be approaching 1 million if it carries on this way. But he also knows, I think the flip side of that is that he's got to keep the war going, because if he stops with anything that isn't saleable to the Russian people as victory, he's in a very difficult position politically.
Yeah, it's the Russian people, and I think those that are supporting him as well, with China and Iran and North Korea. But in typical response terms to Donald Trump's statement, the Russian spokesperson Dmitry Peskov on Monday then said, "This is a very important moment, which is associated with the emotional overload and absolutely everyone with emotional reactions," and that's him describing Donald Trump. He said, "We're truly grateful to the Americans and personally to President Trump for his efforts to bring Moscow and Kyiv to the negotiating table." Is this just a cynical attempt to continue to play Trump, do you think? Or do you think Putin actually cares about his relationship with Trump?
It's very hard to know, isn't it? I mean, the reaction about over-emotionalism, I mean, Peskov's not wrong there. I think it's quite cunning to portray the Russians as being sort of disappointed that the Americans, who are doing tremendously well, haven't been able to do more. And this is all feeding into, of course, a narrative that the Ukrainians and Zelensky in particular are responsible for the war, and behind them are shadowy powers like NATO and sort of nebulous Western interests who have been orchestrating this confrontation between East and West. I don't think Putin would see a breakdown of relations with Trump as a disaster, but he must also realize that Trump is a possible. I mean, Trump is acting as a mark, essentially. That's what he sees Trump as. Trump is there to be manipulated and is providing every indication that he's manipulable. And when he talks about, wanting trade with Russia, wanting to, ease sanctions, certainly putting no more sanctions on, Putin must look at that and think that's a possibility, because Russia's economy is suffering badly. And Russia is reliant essentially at the moment on oil and helpful foreign states like China and Iran, and North Korea, of course, who've been happily sending forces to fight in Ukraine. So I think Putin will always have options. That's the thing. I mean, I've said many a time, and I think I've said to you, he's a KGB officer. And that's how he runs the game. That's how he's always run the game. He was a colonel in the KGB. He got out of East Germany, where he was head of station, I think, by some very slick talking with the angry East German crowds outside the residence. And he was a good spy. And he's carried that into 25 years of running Russia now as president or prime minister. So there's not much you can teach him about manipulating people in negotiations, whereas that is manifestly not true either of Donald Trump or, God help us, of Steve Witkoff.
Well, yes, and it's interesting if you compare the two teams. We've got Putin, and you've described the experience that he's got with his foreign minister Lavrov, who's got equal experience and is past master in foreign affairs and everything else. Up against Donald Trump, who thinks he's got lots of experience. This is his second term as a president, so at least he knows that. But his inner circle is, I would describe, as very light. Marco Rubio is probably the most competent that's there, but he's lost his national security advisor. Pete Hegseth in defense has never run a large department before, and you can't just go from being a frontline soldier to running a large department of state. And as vice president, he seems to be using his position with everything as an apprenticeship for him to potentially take over as the next president. Do you think Trump is suffering from a weakness in his inner team?
I think he's suffering hugely. I think there was an element, although it wasn't complete or entirely beneficial in his first presidency, that at least there were constraints on him because he didn't know how Washington worked. He did have to import some people who knew the ropes. I mean, they weren't always brilliant people. Rex Tillerson was pretty much a disaster as Secretary of State, but Jim Mattis was very solid as Secretary of Defense. Trump now is in the position that happens to a lot of leaders across the spectrum of thinking he knows better than everyone else. He's done this before. So, Marco Rubio is a solid, competent foreign affairs expert, but he's had to sacrifice a lot of self-respect, intellectual coherence, all of these things, because he was one of the final people eventually to fold and think this is the way the Republican Party's going. The only way I'm going to survive is by, paying obeisance to Trump and the sort of the MAGA godheads. So he's had to accept a lot of intellectual and personal humiliation. Hegseth is not a serious person. He's a perfectly competent and well regarded National Guard officer, I'm sure. But he's a Fox News presenter who has, let's be delicate about it, personality border issues, I think we should say. There are lots of accusations, some of which may be true, some of which maybe not, about his personal conduct. But he doesn't seem like somebody who acts in a measured and reasonable way. And he's running a department which has a budget of $1 trillion, and he clearly doesn't know what he's doing. And he's also got virtually no staff around him because they've either resigned or been sacked. So there is a huge dearth of, I wouldn't even say experience, as basic competence around the president. You're seeing him slimming down the National Security Council allegedly to something like 150 people. Rubio is double hatting as National Security Advisor and Secretary of State, which Kissinger struggled with in the mid-70s. And Marco Rubio is not Henry Kissinger, to be polite about it. Mike Waltz was a fairly competent guy, but again, like Rubio, had to sacrifice a lot to get into the inner circle. And you look around and there are just no counterweights to Trump. There's nobody to say to him in private, whatever goes outside this room, I'll back you because you're the president. But this is what I think you're doing catastrophically wrong. And unless you've got people like that, and if you're as self-confident and psychologically unmoored a person as Donald Trump is, there's no help really, because you're just not getting the support. You'll take your first impressionistic view of what's going on, you'll feed it through your own weird lens of essentially family-funded New York real estate business, and you'll think you've come up with the perfect solution. And I think we're discovering, if only with the negotiations with Ukraine, that's clearly not happening.
So as we're trying to read Donald Trump then and his thinking, in that statement where he called Putin crazy, of course he has to be balanced, and then turned on Zelensky. He aimed his criticism towards him and said, likewise, President Zelensky is doing his country no favors by talking the way he does. Everything out of his mouth causes problems. I don't like it, and it better stop. What do you think he means? And why do you think it is that Zelensky riles Trump so much? Could it be something as simple as down to Zelensky's failure to back Trump and investigate Hunter Biden, or something something else?
I think that probably feeds into it. I mean, I think that tweet, Donald Trump has said a lot of offensive things, and I'm not easily offended in the public sphere, but I thought that word likewise was one of the most repellent things he's ever said, because it essentially sets up his whole narrative, which is that this is a sort of faults on both sides issue. It's not. Russia invaded Ukraine. Ukraine is a sovereign country. It's a democracy with some imperfections, but a democracy nonetheless. Russia is an autocracy, and it invaded intending to destroy it. So it's not a case of faults on both sides. Zelensky, it's hard to say. I think there is the Hunter Biden issue. Clearly, Trump feels either persecuted by Ukraine or let down by Ukraine, or some toxic combination of the two. I think he probably dislikes the kind of celebrity that Zelensky has got, and the kind of universal acclaim he received in the West after the invasion, because he showed tremendous personal courage as much as anything else, which is something that is very difficult to assume or to pretend. And I think also there is this continuous narrative within Donald Trump of being the hard done by case. Somebody's doing him down, and I think he's identified Ukraine as a country which has been, in his worldview, sort of taking money from America and taking financial and military support from America, and somehow cheating them. And he said that a few months ago, didn't he, that Zelensky was a wonderful salesman because every time he came to America, he asked for more money. I do think Zelensky probably overstepped the mark when he went to America before the election and allowed himself to be put in positions which could be construed as politically supportive of Joe Biden as a candidate. I think that was a mistake. But at the same time, the guy is leading a country which is fighting for its survival in a full-on conflict. So I'm willing to cut him some slack. But I think there are a whole number of reasons that Trump clearly detests Zelensky, and it is a very visceral hatred. You could see that in the Oval Office in their encounter in February. It's absolutely, bone deep horror of the man. He's everything that Trump dislikes, and that's clearly playing a huge part in the way that Trump is dealing with Ukraine, because Trump deals on a very personal level with leaders and personalities.
Do you think Trump's actually jealous of Zelensky?
I think that could well be part of it. I mean, he sees a man who has been feted around the world for, you know, solid virtues like leadership in crisis, leadership in wartime, courage, straightforwardness, honesty. And it's interesting the criticisms that not so much Trump personally, but the MAGA movement level at Zelensky. I mean, there's always a fundamental truth that when somebody attacks you for something, it's what they're saying about themselves. And so the way they've talked about Zelensky as being a dictator or being corrupt or being a Nazi or being supportive of Nazis, you think it's interesting that those are the aspects of his leadership and his regime which you choose to criticize. But there is clearly I think jealousy probably is about right. I think he sees, in a weird way, he's envious both of Putin and Zelensky, but for different reasons. He sees in Putin a man who has complete mastery over his regime, and who has been in power for 25 years, and is this sort of strong man who rides horses with no shirt on, and hunts bears, all this kind of ridiculous stuff. And he sees that as a kind of alpha male projection of leadership. And at the same time, he sees in Zelensky, I think, a kind of slightly different, back against the wall leadership in adversity, all stripped away of artifice, essentially. And I think he envies that too. He sees two things which he can't do and would like to do. And I think that riles at him, because fundamentally inferiority is core to Donald Trump's being, which is bizarre because he's a multi-billionaire. He's one of the most famous.
And he was a TV personality, and arguably Zelensky was a more successful TV personality.
Indeed. Well, it's interesting that Trump's image as a businessman has, I think, largely been created by The Apprentice, because when he was recruited by Mark Burnett to appear on The Apprentice, he was recruited almost as a stereotype. Mark Burnett wanted a sort of throwback to Wall Street, 1980s, big shoulder pads, that kind of bombastic idea of what a businessman was. And so he thought, what's the most ridiculous, overblown businessman I think of? Donald Trump. And so he recruits him and makes him an enormous star, a bigger star even than he was. And then Trump leverages this and becomes president of the United States. I mean, unless you write The Simpsons, where they did actually predict this, you could not make this up. Yet you have this man leveraging a largely fictitious reputation. I mean, if you look at his business dealings, certainly in the 80s and 90s, they were catastrophic in many ways. And yet he's become the most powerful man in the world twice. It's an extraordinary feat in some ways.
So what do you think's next for the international community? We've got the Russians building up their military forces allegedly to the north of Ukraine. We've got Lavrov and Peskov and everyone turning around saying they want to create buffer zones, and the buffer zone might be the whole of Ukraine. We've got Putin ordering Ukrainian cities to be attacked. Donald Trump's upset, but the coalition of the willing and Europe seems to be stepping up. Do you think this coalition of the willing is going to start to take a greater lead? Do you think we're seeing signs of that in the EU, or is everyone just sitting waiting for Donald Trump's next Truth Social post?
I think the coalition of the willing was an interesting case study, because I give Keir Starmer some credit. He worked very hard with Emmanuel Macron to put together quite a large coalition of disparate countries. I think what he did, which was successful, which was to indicate a way that I think politics is going to be played out over the next 10 years or so, which is essentially ad hoc coalitions doing specific tasks. I think where he fell down was in thinking there was any possibility that this coalition could act independently and impose or even secure or police some kind of peace settlement in Ukraine. There were always internal contradictions in what he and President Macron were saying, because they were talking about numbers that simply were not there. I mean, Keir Starmer was talking about a British contribution first of, I think, about 30,000 soldiers, which was fantasy. Then that was scaled back to about 15,000, which was equally fantasy. And you will know better than I, Philip, that we would be lucky to generate a brigade-sized force, maybe 5,000, to put into Ukraine, even if there were a peace deal, which there is not. Because, of course, to put 5,000 troops into the field, you're talking about 15,000 troops committed to the operation. And these are just numbers we don't have. And they're numbers that nobody else is willing to commit either. The other problem was that both Starmer and Macron kept saying this will all happen, but we need an American backstop of intelligence, logistics, all this kind of stuff. And to be fair to Donald Trump, he was consistently saying we're not doing that, and they were ignoring that and saying yes, but we'll need the American backstop. So it was a sort of confection of ideas based on no solid foundations. So I think that in the coalition of the willing, in that sense, of a force that will go in and secure and police some kind of peace settlement in Ukraine, is not realistic. But I think, as I say, what Starmer has done and what he's gathered allies around him to do is say, look, we are in a situation now where the Americans have disengaged. They may be persuaded to sort of stay where they are rather than retreat even further. But what we are going to need to do is look at individual tasks and work out how we can do them. And you can see that, I mean, obviously NATO remains the centerpiece of our defense policy and should do. But we've got things like the Joint Expeditionary Force, which is some NATO allies, but it operates without NATO. We've negotiated this security and defense partnership with the EU, which at the moment is pretty meaningless, but may have possibilities down the road, though I'm skeptical. We've negotiated bilateral agreements with Germany, which we've seen coming to some fruition with their agreement to develop long-range missiles. So it'll be an Anglo-German missile project. And we've negotiated a bilateral deal with Norway. There's also been talk about revisiting and sort of revivifying the Lancaster House agreements with France. So I think this is going to be the way forward. It's not ideal because, particularly for officials and bureaucrats, of whom I was one for a long time, it doesn't fit into a neat order. You can't say, right, this is when we're meeting, this is the auspices under which we're meeting, this is the file it goes into, and these are the people who are here, and I can write the minutes. It's going to be much messier than that. And it's going to require a lot more agility and neat footwork on behalf of our political leaders. But I don't think we've got any choice, because with the Americans stepping back and focusing much more on the Indo-Pacific, which I think is largely getting obscured at the moment by the sort of fierceness of what's going on in Ukraine, we are just going to have to make do and mend for at least the Trump presidency, and then we'll see what happens in 2028.
Well, most operations in the past, certainly the ones that I've been on, it has been a coalition of the willing, of which the Russians were part of it. In Bosnia, implementing the Dayton Peace Agreement, in Kosovo, we had that famous order to General Sir Mike Jackson from Sakar Wes Clark to stop the Russians from getting to Pristina first and to take Pristina. And when we analysed it, we realised that what the Russians had done was they'd stolen our operation plan, so they'd got good intelligence, but they'd stolen an older version of it that had us arriving 24 hours earlier than we did, and they arrived exactly on time for us going in. So it's always a coalition of the willing. But do you think Donald Trump's actually just trying to set the conditions for him to walk away from Ukraine and reduce his presence in Europe, because he does see this Southeast Asian tilt and what's going on in the Middle East as a higher priority?
I think he probably does. I mean, it's always dangerous to ascribe too much sort of order and logic and foresight to his decision making, so that's not how he works. But I think he does see Europe as, relatively speaking, second order. And more than that, I think he looks at Europe and thinks, well, why is this my problem and not yours? And to an extent, he does have a point there. It grieves me slightly to admit it, but he does have the whisper of a point behind him. But yeah, I think he clearly sees China as the major security threat to the US over the next generation or two. And there are people around him who agree strongly with that view. And he certainly wants to, I think, deploy what forces he has and what forces he's willing to commit to the Far East. At the same time, of course, he's been less than completely supportive of the idea of defending Taiwan's independence. He's talked about Taiwan. Taiwan's only 10 miles from China. It's 3,000 miles from us, or whatever the numbers are. Why is it our problem? And of course, again, we go back to this sense of being hard done by. He blames China for stealing America's semiconductor business, which is not true, but it's true in his head, and therefore it may as well be true for geopolitical purposes. So he sees Taiwan as part of that long list of people, countries, and organizations who have somehow done him down, which has meant that he's focused on China. And if Taiwan is not an essential part of dealing with that, then he will probably let Taiwan go in the ultimate crisis. My own view is that Taiwan is very much the tripwire. If the West, using the term in its broader sense, if the West lets China occupy, seize, control Taiwan, China will think, well, what can't we do? And I think we will then see governments in Tokyo, in Seoul, in Manila think, well, we've got very similar arrangements with the Americans for security. Taiwan has just discovered that they are not worth the paper they're written on. Why are we now attaching ourselves to a country which is far away and somehow unreliable? Is it better for us actually to make some kind of accommodation with the less attractive, larger bullying country which is closer to us and which might actually be in control in the next few years? So I think Taiwan is very much a tipping point.
Interesting. I think if Putin is allowed to keep any part of Ukraine, that could tip Xi Jinping into saying, "Oh, I can negotiate Taiwan then," and all becomes the domino effect. But tying into that, and within the next 7 days, we're hoping to see the UK's Strategic Defence Review published. Ukraine is clearly influencing what's going to come out of that. Do you see the Defence Review as being an actual opportunity for change, or will the Ukraine lessons be a burden that'll tie it down to the last operation? And do you think what sort of message do you think is going to be sent out from it to Russia, to the EU, but probably most importantly to Donald Trump?
I think there is a huge danger that when the Strategic Defence Review is published, there's going to be a sense of, is that it? I've always had concerns that it's going to be less radical and transformative than it needed to be, because when the terms of reference were published back in July last year, they were very limited in terms of setting out what the SDR couldn't look at, because they ruled out any discussion of the nuclear deterrent, which is a considerable part of the MOD's budget and something ultimately you can't save money on. You can't scrimp on nuclear weapons. It ruled out any change to our posture in the Indo-Pacific, in the Gulf, in the Gulf of Arabia, in the Middle East, and it said that the cornerstone of our defence policy was NATO, the great incantation, which has kept Britain going for 75 years. So it ruled out so much that there wasn't a great deal left in the middle with which the independent reviewers could play. And also, it had this strange weasel word formulation in it that it would set the path for increasing defence spending to 2.5% of GDP. Now, in fairness, we have now got a commitment that will happen from 2027. What's interesting, and the human part of me feels slightly sorry for Keir Starmer in this, is that he announced this defence spending increase back in February and took quite a lot of heat for it because he was raiding the international aid budget to fund it. I think it needed to be done. But he now looks around and finds that everybody's gone beyond him. Poland are spending 4.7% this year. NATO are now talking. You were talking about the Dayton Agreement. The NATO Parliamentary Assembly was in Dayton, Ohio this weekend. And Mark Rutte, the NATO Secretary General, said that he expected the NATO summit next month to agree essentially that spending would go up to 5% of GDP. Now, that may be something like 3.5% on actual defence spending, and then the extra 1.5% on things like cybersecurity, infrastructure, associated spending. But it leaves Keir Starmer's 2.5% with an ambition, as he called it, to go to 3% during the next Parliament, looking somehow rather patchy and modest. And there's also the problem with the spending increase is that I think what a lot of people haven't taken on board, if they're not defence obsessives, and there's no reason they should be, is that the extra money will basically, with any luck, get us back to where we say we already are. We have a huge gap at the moment between our commitments and the resources we have available for those commitments. When the National Audit Office and the Public Accounts Committee last year looked at the Ministry of Defence's equipment plan for the next 10 years, they found a shortfall of at least £17 billion. Actually, people think it's more like 19 or 20 billion pounds. The extra money that Sir Keir Starmer is promising is £13.4 billion a year. So we're basically, we're not replacing the roof. We're fixing the roof we've got. But my worry is that people will think, well, all this money, why haven't we got a new roof? There's this huge sort of mismatch between, because we've lagged so far behind, as has the Germans, by the way. I think they will find they're spending tens of billions of euros just to get the Bundeswehr back to where people think it already is, which is going to be another problem. So I think the SDR is going to be limited in the sense that there's not enough money to be transformative. There's not the scope within the terms of reference to be transformative. And also, it's a sort of moving target because we haven't had the spending review yet. We're waiting for a new national security strategy, which was kind of sprung on us a few months ago. And there are a dozen other reviews which connect to our general security posture going on in Whitehall, not least the much awaited audit of our relations with China, which the government now seems to be regretting ever promising to do. So you're left with a review that will come out, next week probably, but will be so contingent on so many other things that it's hard to say what it will mean. And I think what it will mean to other people is you haven't thought this through, have you? Or you haven't got the money to think this through.
So, I plan to do more stuff, but try and fix your own roof. Eliot, I think that's probably a good point to stop. Thank you very much indeed for talking to me on Frontline today.
Pleasure.
You've been watching Frontline with me, Philip Ingram. If you'd like to be amongst the first to get exclusive content, please subscribe to Times Radio membership at the link below. You can also listen to Times Radio for the latest updates on global affairs or read about them at thetimes.com. Thank you.